to hear life from their side. So we have a wonderful speaker who was willing to share her story. Her name is Jenny Millkey, and she is an interesting, dynamic, creative person. I met her last night, and I talked to her on the phone. She is a passionate horse rescuing, grammar-loving, aerial dancing 29-year-old. She told me on the phone when we first spoke that at the age of 7, she started developing an eating disorder, and she hid her growing issues and challenges from her parents until her dance teacher told her parents about her situation at the age of 15. So she went 8 years in hiding. And through intensive DBT treatment, as well as expressive and animal therapies, Jenny says she found that in addition to having all that bottled up self-hatred, which many people who suffer from borderline have, shame and self-hatred as much as anger, in addition to finding that bottled up self-hatred, she found bottled up passion. And she went on to receive her master's degree in religion, and she now runs a thriving local tutoring business called Live, Love, Learn Tutoring. How great is that name? And using her experiences in treatment and recovery from mental illness, Jenny emphasizes a holistic and a creative approach to making learning fun and accessible to students, no matter what kind of challenge they face. With this newfound voice that she has, and with her rediscovered, the word she uses is whimsy, I love that word, Jenny has also embraced that responsibility of speaking out and advocating for those who have yet to find their own voice and their own sources of joy. She's often requested as a speaker now to different mental health organizations, and we are delighted to have her share her story. So I'd have you welcome Jenny Millkey. And she is easy. She has just one slide. Let me find that slide for you. There we go.
Hi. So the title in the program and that was just on the board was Linguistics of Learning to Live, because the polyglottal conglomeration of recovery was too long. So I've always been a word nerd, a voracious reader, an aspiring polyglot. I can defend the English subjunctive, debate the Oxford comma, and dissect words with giddy gleefulness. Once I even beat my dad by 150 points at Scrabble. But it wasn't until much more recently that I found the courage to set aside shame and put words to my feelings and my fears. I was always shy, introverted, extremely sensitive, and anxious. I'm pretty much always tired because feigning confidence zapped all of my energy during the day, while nightmares plagued my sleep. The piles of books in my room offered me temporary escape into worlds where I felt safe. I chose my middle school based on it being the only one around that would let me start not one, but 2 languages simultaneously. I jumped right into German and Latin, falling madly in love with the grammar rules and their exceptions, the philological structures, and the general philosophical nature of language. Since then, I've dabbled in Mandarin, Swahili, Biblical Hebrew, and that random yet very fun semester of Spanish. I also have a book called How to Speak Horse, and a purple lead rope I use as my tail when communicating with hooved herds. So I like to think I'm fairly versatile and open-minded. I kept seeking out new languages and words with the hope that I'd find one that felt safe enough to let me stop hiding from the world. A language that would be effective and voicing my truths and asking for the validation I so desperately craved. Oh, there are so very many languages out there, but the one I needed most as an insecure adolescent was DBT. How very differently things might have progressed had middle school health class, if we'd even had health class, taught me about wise mind and mindfulness, how to self-soothe in times of panic, how self-care isn't innately selfish, the semantic and practical differences between guilt and shame, and how to communicate effectively without compromising my self-respect. Although I guess I would have needed to find some self-respect first. As with any language, the younger one starts learning, the more rapidly one develops fluency. So elementary school is so ideal. This journey to find what I now know was a makeshift substitute for the language of DBT began with self-harm and an eating disorder when I was 7. It was just that no one recognized those behaviors as languages until 15 years later. In 11th grade, my dance teacher called my school counselor, who pulled me out of a pop quiz to tell me my dad was on the way to school to take me to a psychiatrist for an assessment. I thought that as a teenager, I probably ought to feel indignant and betrayed, but really I succumbed to relief. This thus began a chain of events I hadn't known how to prompt. Normally, I recoiled at any sort of physical touch, even with the contamination of the air around me or with particular fabrics. And somehow, when that psychiatrist, ever so gently, and her soothing French accent during that very first emergency assessment, murmured, "Stop shaking, baby, it's okay," I longed to curl up next to her and have her stroke my back. I learned what safe felt like, however momentary, and I longed for more. Even though personality disorder was one of 3 diagnoses this doctor mentioned to me that first session, 2 days before my first hospitalization, she didn't say it to my parents. And I subsequently only heard it spoken in hushed tones or in passing for the next decade. Maybe it was because I was technically too young for the diagnosis at the time. Maybe it was because it's a scary diagnosis for providers to treat or family members to accept. Who knows? Regardless, back then, self-harm was just this shameful family secret, not a language. I couldn't find a bilingual dictionary no matter how many trips I made to Barnes & Noble. It was something we didn't discuss. Don't get me wrong. I didn't want to talk about it with my parents. Talking would have been dreadful and horrifying, so I was very relieved to avoid family therapy. I got dropped off downstairs at my psychiatrist's office every Thursday, dispensed my own medications, and kept hiding my insecurities, pathologies, and behaviors. I also felt fairly invisible. The pain and shame were so enormous that my malnourished brain could focus on little else. And because nobody knew, I thought my pain couldn't be real. Even when I experienced severe physical pain, doctors kept telling me nothing was wrong. It must just be anxiety. So I thought I was crazy and making things up. Who would have believed me anyway? Anyways, the doctors didn't. Why would anyone else? Why would my words have mattered? It took me until my mid-20s to be able to say aloud sex, much less sexual abuse, or heaven forbid, anorexia, self-harm, mental illness. Nothing about treatment really clicked. I was terrified that if I stopped my self-destructive behaviors, I would be deemed better enough and henceforth lose my support team and my safe sanctuary. To this day, the first place I think of when I'm told to visualize a safe space, the place I think of when I'm told to visualize a safe space, I picture the plush couches in my first psychiatrist's waiting room. Sick enough to need therapy, but well enough not to get fired for being treatment resistant was an awkward balance to keep. One might even call it a dialectic. Even in safety, I never imagined I'd feel safe enough to share the deepest of my secrets. I had no idea I was allowed to say anything. I need you to know I'm not okay. I needed to hear that being sensitive wasn't necessarily a character flaw to suppress. The reason I hid those party invitations wasn't because I didn't want to have friends, but because the noise and the chaos were overstimulating and utterly draining. I need you to tell me it's okay sometimes to not feel okay. I needed you not to not always believe the smiling straight A, I'm just tired because I have too much homework, perfect student with a perfect family mask. I need to feel safe. I needed you to tell me you could protect yourself, that I didn't have to. I needed you to tell me you'd protect me as well. I need you to be my mom. I need you to believe me. I've come to realize that I was reaching every which way to find a language that would allow my pain to be validated. Perhaps having access to the language of DBT at an earlier age than 25 would have helped me feel less alone, less out of control. It wouldn't have necessarily changed my experiences or the stumbling blocks of my journey. And still, maybe I would have learned to ask for validation rather than resent myself for being stuck in a rut of self-hatred, self-harm, and shame. I'd been in and out of treatment centers and hospitals since I was 15. All of them at my pushing and request because my parents weren't able to recognize that self-harm, restriction, and purging, even when I tried to stop hiding the behaviors, were the only way I knew of screaming at them that when I didn't have words, silently screaming to get them to acknowledge my pain and that something was wrong, screaming for validation. Ultimately, though, I was the one to make the phone calls. At 15, 16, and 26, I convinced my mom that my psychiatrist was right and that I needed hospital stabilization. At 19, after months of wanting to see how much weight I had to lose before my parents intervened, I finally gave up on them, set up an intake assessment at a local eating disorder center, and then asked them if I could go to the appointment. I sought out equine-assisted psychotherapy, and then rescued an anxious codependent addict of a horse myself. My introduction to DBT was actually at a national training conference for using horses as co-therapists. Horses got me feeling healthy enough to accept a full ride to seminary out of state, something that before I wouldn't have even considered. In my second year, my parents drove up to my graduate school in Tennessee to bring me home after I called to say I no longer wanted to be alive. A gutsy call showing just how despondent I'd gotten. After weeks of seemingly futile research for a program that would take a mood disorder client without any substance abuse issues, I found Skyland Trail and met with someone from admissions. I desperately wanted to get better, and I was equally terrified. I need you to know that I didn't like lying to you about how I was doing. Actually, I had even more shame for hiding my behaviors and thoughts. I know I frightened you, and I tried my best to protect you. I needed you to tell me that you could protect yourself and that it wasn't my job as the child to take on that responsibility. I need you to know that while I am so grateful for all of your support, I needed a team I could trust to accept and contain my gigantic emotions. It wasn't until I checked myself into Skyland Trail that I found people who were able to recognize my behaviors as unspoken languages. So translation had been murky at best. Mostly, I just buried each clause, each phrase, each bold statement deeper and deeper inside until even I forgot they were there. In the first of only a couple of family sessions over the course of my year at Skyland Trail, my primary counselor pulled out her thick DSM-4 and read aloud the criteria for a BPD diagnosis, point by point, word for word. I'd known for years that this was my diagnosis, and yet this session was pivotal. No longer could my family be in denial about my mental illness. No longer did I get lost questioning whether or not my pain was real and why I couldn't just get over it. I had a real illness with a name and a treatment. This counselor introduced biosocial theory, the idea that emotional vulnerability is biological and that an invalidating environment can make it all the more difficult to regulate emotions. This session opened the doors for me to test out the languages of truth and honesty. Suppressing anger, denying its existence, and deliberately punishing myself instead had become instinctual. My counselor told me in no uncertain terms it was time to CTSO. She even wrote it on my hand in Sharpie once. CTSO, or cut that shit out. Maybe not a Marshall Linehan term, and effective nonetheless. I'd technically been in treatment for a decade, but I had been trying to stay atop the emotion mind, rational mind, teeter-totter that gave me perpetual motion sickness. DBT taught me the skills to find more balance, to find wise mind. This period of DBT immersion at Skyland was the first time I didn't sabotage my treatment process because I started to believe that being me was okay. It might be enough. I finally found the courage to test the waters of translating my pain into spoken words so that others might finally understand. For the first time, I experienced what it felt like to be real, to be truthful, to be bold. For the first time, I could receive external validation, which allowed me to evaluate my own truths. You see, validation can be a misleading term. Praises for being smart and talented, while feel good in the moment, are only one form of validation. They're like the superficial Band-Aid that allows the world to see picture perfect. Except there's no medicine under the bandage, and unspoken expectations fester while shame deepens. Validating statements in an invalidating environment is a very real dialectic. I need you to know it's possible to validate feelings without having to provide solutions. And unless I ask directly, that's actually preferable. I need you to know I need more reassurance than I'd like to admit. Part of living with BPD is experiencing intense, choking fears of being abandoned. Yes, now I am able to recognize that many of these fears are irrational, and that doesn't make them any less real. I've had enough people abandon me or leave unexpectedly, and I have a hard time trusting anyways. I need more reassurance than most people. I need you to be my mom and to believe me. The languages I knew before DBT had helped me survive in the world. DBT gave me a basic linguistic framework and a new vocabulary, albeit one mostly of acronyms, that together took me past merely surviving and to a point where I'm at last living. I no longer have to cling solely and desperately onto someone else's words as shields behind which to hide myself. I have built around me a life worth living. I graduated seminary with a master's degree in religion. I trained with an aerial dance performance team. I started and run my own tutoring company. I tell my students, many of whom struggle with dyslexia and other processing disorders, that together we're embarking on language detective training. And I try to validate in ways that reach each student individually. My team and I are successful because we operate around the philosophy that learning is innately fun. It's our job as tutors to help our students fill their toolboxes with skills to manage their struggles and anxieties, and to help our kiddos find mastery, freedom, and joy in language, whether it be written, read, spoken, signed, or sung. I need you to know I still have a lot of anxiety. I still struggle, and I still need validation. The difference now, though, is that I know I can also give it to myself, and I know I can ask for it as well. Thank you.
take questions or not?
I can do questions.
My comment is wow. I don't know what else to say. Jenny says she's willing, I see some, not a dry eye in the room, but she's willing to take a few questions to see the world from her shoes. Anybody have any questions? Yes. Hold on, let us get a microphone. Right here, right here.
Not now, but earlier, did you actually know what was wrong, like that you were lying, or were you aware of that, or was it just like an unconscious?
Which part?
You know, when you said you were hiding and you were lying and trying to cover it up, and you were making, you know, like sort of kind of. Are you aware of that?
I knew I was hiding. I knew I didn't think anybody would believe me if I said anything. And I didn't feel like I had a reason for feeling the way I felt. And so I pushed it down and took it out on myself instead. And because I knew that was scary for somebody else to deal with, I didn't want to put that burden on anybody. So I just kept stuffing it down.
So there is a sense of awareness that something is
Yes.
wrong, but you don't know what, yeah.
Yes, but I didn't feel like I had reason for anything to be wrong. So I couldn't say it.
So calling it BPD or getting that diagnosis actually was a relief, like you felt like it was helpful?
Yes. Yes.
Any other questions? Here's one over here.
Jenny, I'm just curious about what you got at Skyland Trail that you didn't get elsewhere, and how that helped you turn the corner.
Did you all hear that? What did you get at Skyland Trail that you didn't hear elsewhere?
It was I was immersed in DBT 5 days a week. Even though I'd go home and to the residence the first week and try to read ahead and do all the homework, and I was going to master this and knock it out and move on. It doesn't quite work that way. It was, but that was my approach. I wanted it to be very academic, like very just structured academic. And my therapist, my first meeting with her, threw that all aside, told me I had entirely too many goals, and that her objective, or her goal for me, was to learn how to have fun. So she took out the schedule and she circled, oh, horticulture. The most fun you're ever going to have is with Libba. And then the next row had art. And she was like, unless you're with Helen. And circled that and goes, have you ever thought about woodworking? And so really the permission to find, it was the expressive therapies along with the DBT that allowed, the expressive therapies allowed me to really practice the DBT, even though I didn't realize it, because I'm tone deaf, as they told me in seminary, singing class, and I still went to music group and was encouraged to sing and validated, and didn't have to be perfect at something in order to take part in it, and it just allowed me to practice the skills without realizing I was practicing them, and to rediscover that there were passions hidden deep down that I could find again.
Maybe one more question? Any other questions in the group?
What would be maybe one thing that, I'm a therapist, that a therapist could take away from what it's like to live with this disorder?
Could you all hear the question? What's it like to live with this disorder?
Like, what would you want a therapist to understand about your experience?
Speaking is really hard. For probably the first 6 months, at least, that I was here, all of my communication with my therapist was notes slid under her door that she'd then make me read back to her. So,
That really helps. Thank you.
Let's thank Jenny again.